Hey, today we're going to talk about complementarity. Complementarity is a pattern of interactions between two people that's been a fundamental principle of interpersonal theory for several decades. It's fairly simple. It has two rules. The first one is that if one person's dominant, the other person's likely to be submissive. And the second rule is if one person's warm, the other person's likely to be warm as well. And so if you play that out across the entire circumplex, you get patterns like you see on this slide. Dominant behaviors related to submissive behavior and vice versa. If I am submissive and I invite you to lead, that puts you in the position where you're likely to be more leading and controlling and assured and dominant, and vice versa. Likewise, if I'm nice to you, you're likely to be nice back. If I'm not nice to you, you're likely to not be nice to me back. And then there's, of course, combinations. If I'm warm dominant, the way a teacher or a parent might tend to be, then you might take a more warm submissive position where you will be compliant and you'll listen and you'll take my advice or instruction. Likewise, if I'm aggressive and rude and arrogant, then you will withdraw and um, be more aloof, more introverted, and try to sort of get away from me and not to take control. So complementarity is a really intuitive idea. It feels unnatural to not be complementary, and there's a lot of evidence supporting the idea that people, generally speaking, are complementary when they interact with each other. This kind of evidence comes in two forms. The first one is within situations, and that's the way I've been describing it. That is, while two people are interacting, as one person gets warmer, the other person gets warmer as well. As one person gets more dominant, the other person gets more submissive, and vice versa. You can see this in the figure on the top here, where on the left-hand side you have warmth complementarity. The solid line is one person, the dashed line is the other person. As you can see that as the line goes up for one person, it goes up for the other. So as warmth increases for one, it increases for the other as well. And then as the two people get colder, they tend to get colder together. So you see these kind of cycles or waves in the data where people are getting warmer and colder and warmer and colder while they interact. Pattern is opposite for dominance, which you can see on the right-hand side. In this case, as one person becomes more dominant, then the other person becomes less dominant, right? So here you can see that the black line goes up and then the dashed line goes down, and then they immediately switch, and then they switch back again, and then they switch back again. So you still get cycles, but now there's a kind of hydraulic cycling rather than a concordant cycling between the two time series. You can also study complementarity between situations. So now instead of thinking about how two people behave with each other while they're interacting, you can think about how one person behaves across interactions. So in these kinds of studies are usually done using ecological momentary assessment paradigms with smartphones, in which uh, uh, people are either prompted once in a while throughout the day, or maybe they're told at the beginning of the study, every time you have an interaction, provide ratings. And then you rate both themselves and the other person for both warmth and dominance. And then you can calculate complementarity, which represents whether during interactions in which I was warm, did I also see the other person as warm? During interactions in which I was more dominant, did I also see the other person as more submissive, and vice versa? So, again, there's been a lot of studies using both of these kinds of approaches, and evidence from both of these studies support complementary patterns, although that doesn't necessarily mean that complementarity is the same thing across these two different levels. Another important kind of exception is what complementarity and dominance means. Lorna Smith Benjamin made the point that it's true that the complement of dominance is submission, but the opposite is not dominance. So if I try to control you and you submit, you're being complementary. But it would be weird for me to try to control you and then you try to control me back. You can imagine a scenario where that might happen, but more likely, Benjamin's point is that more likely, instead of being controlled and submitting to me, you will just take autonomy. You'll say, no, I'm not going to do what you say. I'm not going to follow your lead. I'm going to do my own thing. Um, and so for her, it was important to separate these two different surfaces, what the first person's bid in terms of control versus granting autonomy, and then the second person's response in terms of either submitting or taking autonomy. There are certain situations where this SASB model of Benjamin is really important. So, for example, in parenting kinds of studies, it might be really important for the researcher to know not so much is the kid trying to control the parent, but when the parent tries to guide or control the kid, is the kid responding by being compliant and submissive, or are they not listening and doing their own thing instead? There's also evidence from the SASB that you find complementarity when conceptualized this way, but it's a slightly different kind of complementarity than we think about with the single surface interpersonal circle. Now, the reason complementarity is so intuitive is because non-complementarity feels really weird. So when I teach about this in my classes, I have people I sort of give people rules in secret and say, act in this way. So, for example, whenever a person's warm and dominant, you should be cold and dominant instead. Whenever a person's cold and submissive, you should be warm and submissive instead. So perfect non-complements. And those interactions feel really forced and awkward. It's really unnatural to have those kinds of interactions. And that's why, on the one hand, complementarity is so common, so easy to understand, so intuitive behaviorally as you're interacting with people. You just kind of fall into complementary patterns. And non-complementary patterns are noticeable. They tend to be stressful, they tend to produce anxiety, they tend to be um, unstable. And so if you have a non-complementary interaction, usually one of two things happens. Either one person has to kind of adjust their approach in order to resolve into a complementary pattern, or the two people stop talking to each other. So that's another way to resolve non-complementarity, right? But there are also times when non-complementarity can be strategic or can be a likely pattern. So, for example, in athletics or in a debate where both sides are trying to sort of score points, both people will tend to be dominant, right? This is a natural and expectable pattern, and it can even be one that feels good, where people who are competitive like to have dominant interactions with other people. Terry Tracy made the point that non-complementary behavior can be used strategically in psychotherapy. So he had a three-stage model of psychotherapy that says, in the beginning sessions or the beginnings of a session, you want to compliment a client in order to establish rapport, make things smooth, make things go easy. So if a client is dominant, says, I know exactly what my problems are, I know what you should do to help me, I just need you to guide me, and you say, good, it sounds like you've really thought about stuff, I'm here to help. On the other hand, if a client says, like, I don't know, I've tried everything, I'm out of ideas, I just need someone to tell me what to do, then the complementary response might be something like, I think I can help you, I have some expertise, I have some ideas that may be useful to you. But his idea is that if that sort of complementary pattern persists throughout the therapy, then the patient's unlikely to change. So that submissive client who goes around asking other people to guide them is, if they get the constant feedback from the therapist that the therapist is also going to guide them, they don't learn how to take agency for themselves, right? So the middle stage in Tracy's model is to use non-complementarity to introduce conflict. The idea is the client says, well, I didn't do my homework. I don't know. I'm just not sure why. And now, instead of taking a dominant position by guiding or problem solving, the therapist might say, I don't know either. What do you think? What do you think you should do? Right? And that should create some anxiety in the client. And the way to resolve the anxiety for the client is to become dominant, to take more agency, to take more control. And the idea is if that pattern can generalize outside of the therapy, then they will have learned a new skill. And so if that happens in Tracy's model, then the third stage is a resolution where there's a return to a kind of more flexible variation of complementarity. So this is one example where non-complementarity could be strategic. There are times in life where might make sense not to compliment, where if you don't want someone being nice to you, then responding to their warmth with coldness might be a good idea. If a person's being really distant and you want to get close to them, responding to their coldness with warmth might be a good idea, etc. At the same time, generally speaking, there's strong evidence that patterns tend to be complementarity, and deviations that are systematic and predictable from complementary patterns might indicate problems, psychopathology, strained relationship, etc. Okay, that was complementarity. See you next time.